Okay, things seem to have settled down a bit, so I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for attending this special Bradley Fellows event with our guest, Mr. Rick Kammen. And I'm going to more or less let Rick introduce himself a bit as we go into this session, but I want to make a couple of quick announcements first. First of all, can the Bradley Fellows who are here stand up again, please? I just want you all to know who they are in case you have questions about our program or about what we're trying to accomplish here with this new criminal law program. These are folks you can go to at any time and speak with them about it. So thanks very much. The other announcement I wanted to make while I have you all here is I assume that a number of you are 1L students, current 1L students, who might be interested in the Bradley Fellows program going forward. Know that there are some curricular requirements for the Bradley Fellows program, so as you choose your classes for next year, I'll just tell you, for example, that taking the criminal procedure classes is one of the things that you would want to do if you're interested in the Bradley Fellows program. You would need to, at some point, sign up to do an externship with Professor Morrison, who's sitting in the back of the room. Anyway, pay attention to the curricular requirements, even though we're not asking you to apply for the program until the end of the year. Be aware now as you sign up for next year's classes that you should pay attention to those criminal procedure and related courses. And if you have any questions about that, again, ask either me, you can shoot me an email, or ask any of the current Bradley Fellows who were standing just a minute ago. Okay? All right. Well, then we're going to get started. I want to give as much time as possible for our guest to speak with us. And we're going to leave lots of time for student questions, probably around 20 till or maybe even 25 till the hour. We'll turn it open for student questions. So my guest is Rick Kammen. Rick is one of the very best and quite possibly the most prominent private criminal defense attorney in the state of Indiana. He's been doing this for a while. He's handled a number of high-profile cases, cases you might very well, especially if you're local, you might very well be aware of. You might have seen his name in the news recently, New York Times, etc., Washington Post. We'll get into that a little bit later, although I've told Rick all the way that he's free to tell us he can't answer questions because of national security and so forth. But I've heard him do this before, and he will manage to tell us quite a bit, even within the limitations that he may have.
Yeah, I won't have to kill you, don't worry.
There you go. There you go. Well, we know they're listening anyway,
sure.
So...
We do know that.
We do know that. All right, so we're going to do this very informally. I'm going to just throw questions at Rick and let him riff. And I suspect we'll have no trouble filling an hour.
Okay.
So let me start with your background. You went to college in Wisconsin. You went to law school in New York City. We were just talking about that a few minutes ago. What brought you to Indiana?
Well, I'd grown up in Indianapolis. I mean, that was my home. I went to New York, with the notion that I was going to be a big-time New York lawyer, but 3 years in New York and being exposed to all that nonsense pretty much convinced me that any place but New York would be good. To show you how much I liked law school, the last 2 years of law school at NYU at that time, they made you feel like if you didn't make law review, you could finish the next 2 years if you wanted, but you were pretty much going to be unemployable as a lawyer because you couldn't get a clerkship or any of that stuff. So I had to stay in law school to stay out of the Army, and so I spent 2 years driving a cab part-time in New York City, which taught me more about how to be a lawyer than anything they taught me at NYU, which I've said that at NYU and they don't laugh there either. In fact, they frown a lot and never invite me back. In any event, as I said, I was from Indiana. I had worked one summer after my first year for a guy who was a very prominent criminal defense lawyer. That's what I always wanted to do. When it turned out I was only going to have to go into the Army for 6 months, he offered me a job, and sort of the rest is history. But to give you an example of how things have changed, they had a part-time public defender system where you were actually a political appointee of the judge, and you worked for the judge. But there was no training. There was nothing like that. The first 3 trials I tried, the training was watch a couple of trials, and then, okay, you're ready. And so the first 3 trials I tried were murder trials. Now, the first guy, if he's still alive, is still there, because that didn't go so well. You never want to read the transcript of your first trial, and anything, but especially if it's a murder trial. The second 2 worked out all right, but that's kind of the short version of the history.
So you said you always wanted to be a criminal lawyer, always wanted to do defense side?
Yes.
What made you decide that? Was this like a childhood dream? That seems a little bit peculiar.
Well, I was a peculiar child, according to my parents, so that would fit right in. I don't know. Maybe it was Perry Mason. Who really knows what it was? I can remember my father was a doctor, and on Sundays, to escape my mother, he would go to the hospital, and I would go with him. And Forrest Bowman was a patient of his. And there was a case at the time, the Gertrude Banaszewski case. It was a torture thing. It was one of the many iterations of the trial of the century in Indianapolis. And Forrest was representing one of the defendants. So I was talking to my dad about this, and he said, well, I have a patient who's representing one of those guys. And I said, well, that sounds pretty interesting. He says, well, criminal lawyers are looked down on by the rest of the bar, which was certainly true at the time. And for some reason, that really appealed to me. It's like, okay, I found my niche. So from then on, that's what I wanted to do. And, I tell a joke, but, I'm literally the guy who, when I go to court, you're looking at a guy whose childhood dream came true. Now, I'm only 32 and look like this, but
Now, did you ever contemplate doing prosecution side work? Some people do both in their careers. Did you ever think about that, and why not?
Well, I wanted to do the defense. I was doing the defense work. I suppose there were individual cases where you'd say, boy, that would be fun to be the prosecutor on that case. But, it was just, I had found my niche and I was comfortable and,
Now, do you have good relationship with the prosecutors you know? Do you hang out with them? Do you go drinking with them?
Well, ask Tim Morrison.
Yeah.
When I was younger, yes. Younger when everyone was the same age. There tended to be a little bit more camaraderie. We all went to the same bars. We all hung out. It was friendly. After I started doing death penalty cases, the mindset was different for me. When the government's trying to kill your client, it's kind of hard to be pals with the guy who's sort of thinking that would be okay. And then as you get a little bit older, there's a little bit of difference. And the other thing that happened that I think changed things a lot was that the penalties became so much harsher. And the stakes became so much higher that, again, it became more adversarial. And as it became more adversarial, it became more contentious. But some of that was also my personality. one prosecutor told me that his, if I swear, is that like going to really offend anybody? I don't give a shit, but no, but one prosecutor told me that his family thought my first name was that fucking because it was that fucking Kammen. So that's kind of, it's close probably doesn't describe things.
Okay. So let's talk about some of these changes that you mentioned. Plea bargaining, for example. Obviously, it's a very different world when the prosecution has the kind of draconian punishments and some of the powers that they've got. How do you feel about plea bargaining in the modern world? I assume you still have to do it.
Sure. In a perfect world, if they charge a case, the case would go to trial. Certainly, I went into criminal law. We tried a lot more cases back in the day than they do now. I think the statistics are something like 99% of the cases, certainly in federal court and probably in state court as well, get resolved by pleas. When I started, first there was more independent. When I started, there was actually jury sentencing, but then there was indeterminate sentencing, and there was parole. So the risk to the client was quite a bit different than it is now, and with the advent of the federal sentencing guidelines, which just ramped up the exposure tremendously, and then that sort of morphed into the state courts. The risk to the client become too high when the client was facing, the prosecution offered 5 years where the client might do 2.5 or 3, and 10 years where the client might do 3.5 or 4. The risk was not that great, but now you have the client being offered 10 years, and if he goes to trial and loses, he gets 30 or 40, and there's just too much risk. And so, the power that has morphed to the prosecution, is just extraordinary. The other thing that's happened in federal court, in some courts, is that there's a real definitive trial tax on defendants who go to trial and lose. Under the federal sentencing guidelines, if the defendant testifies and said, I didn't do it, I didn't know, and the judge finds he committed perjury, which is just a way of ramping up the sentence, and there's a lot of different ways that judges can pile on, and so the risk of going to trial becomes, just so great that, and that's too bad.
And that must obviously change the way that you talk to your clients.
It changes the way you talk to your clients. And I have had clients, and I suspect any criminal defense lawyer who's honest who have absolutely insisted they were innocent, who you said, look, you've got to take this plea. You just can't take the risk. I had a client who was charged with child molesting, who I have no doubt was innocent. And the judge just said essentially took the position, look, I'm going to make sure he gets convicted. And I said, well, you have to set an appeal bond. He says, yeah, I can set an appeal bond he can't make. And he'll do a year or 2 years waiting on the appeal. Well, they offered him a plea of a year. He had to take it with enormous consequences to him personally. But, at the end, it's his decision, but you had to tell them the truth. And the truth is that sometimes, it can be a very, very hard, abusive system sometimes.
How do you deal with the fact that your clients very frequently, maybe most of the time, end up with results that aren't happy endings for them? How do you deal with that?
Well, that's one of the downsides of the work. You're sort of, in some cases, the equivalent of the cancer doctor, where you are presenting the client, where the client legitimately has no good choices. And going to trial is not a good choice, taking the plea is not a good choice, and very often you feel one of the occupational hazards is you can feel like you're just sort of escorting people on the pipeline from freedom to prison. And that gets wearing. I've been fortunate being invited to teach and being invited to teach in various programs around the country where you're with lawyers who do the same kind of work and you can share the frustrations is helpful. I mean, that's probably been the biggest saving grace for me is, we sit around and talk and everyone's got the same problems, and just knowing you're not alone is really helpful.
Tell us about your most memorable client or case. You can choose how you want to answer that.
Wow.
Well, you don't have to pick one. You can pick more than one.
Certainly all of the death penalty cases in their own way have been memorable. The David Camm case was certainly memorable.
You might have to fill in. Some of our students come from out of state, may not be aware of what that is.
Well, David Camm was an Indiana State trooper who, I guess it's 15 years ago now, was charged with killing his wife and 2 children. He was absolutely innocent. He stood trial, was convicted. It was reversed basically for prosecutorial misconduct. Stood trial a second time, and all the time he had good lawyers. I mean, so this was, he stood trial a second time, was convicted again. The case was again reversed for prosecutorial misconduct. I was one of the lawyers in the third trial, and he was found not guilty. And so, I mean, he spent 13 years in prison for a crime he absolutely did not commit. So that was interesting, first because, I mean, I like David very much, but secondly, the pressure of representing a person you absolutely believe is innocent is overwhelming. And I'm ashamed to admit the number of times I would sort of say to myself, if not to anyone else, why did I get myself into this? Because that was enormous personal pressure. Then, of course, the Guantanamo case has been interesting for a whole lot of reasons. And, representing a person who's obviously from a different culture, who was tortured by the CIA, was profoundly damaged, and where the relationship literally over the course of 10 years went from, why would you come see me? Your, mother is a camel's whore, to please don't leave, was, I think, an extraordinarily gratifying situation, both for me and the other members of the teams who made that happen. So all of that's been interesting.
I want to just fill in again. I don't know how many of our students are already aware. Excuse me, are already aware of the the Guantanamo case that you're referring to. Mr. Kammen is no longer, but was maybe again. Maybe again. The lead defense attorney for Mr. al-Nashiri, who was accused of terrorism as the alleged mastermind of the bombing of the USS Cole in the year 2000. And this was, as I understand it, it was the first, or would have been the first, could be the first capital trial to actually be conducted in the Guantanamo setting, in the military tribunals.
If it were to go to trial.
If it were to go to trial. And Mr. Kammen was, because it was a capital case, the military tribunal needed a capitally experienced defense attorney. Didn't have one handy in the military, and therefore reached out to Mr. Kammen to become the lead defense attorney in that case. And that started about 2000.
I first met al-Nashiri in 2008, so I was representing him really for 10 years.
And did you just get a phone call out of the blue to do this?
Yeah, I was recruited by the ACLU. The National ACLU had what they called the John Adams Project, in which they arranged for experienced capital defense lawyers to assist the military lawyers, both in the Nashiri case and in for the 5 defendants who were charged with the 9/11 attack. And so I was one of those that was recruited by the ACLU. And then in 2009, they changed the law to require what's called learned counsel when they rewrote what's the Military Commissions Act. And, literally because I had a relationship with the client, I knew the case, the government was really forced to hire me. So then I became a contractor for the Department of Defense, something that neither the Department of Defense or I ever thought would ever happen.
So Mr. al-Nashiri, he's been at Guantanamo since
2006.
2006. And you may have encountered his name even more recently, just in the last couple of weeks, because he has been one of the people. There's been this controversy over President Trump's the woman who's going to potentially become the. Go ahead. You
well, the woman who was nominated to be the head of the CIA, a woman named Gina Haspel, was very active in the CIA's torture program, and at least according to published reports, presided over the torture that was inflicted on our client when he was in what we're allowed to call black site green. What's publicly known about the torture through the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence torture report and stuff that's come out in the media is really about 30% of the reality. The reality of what this U.S. did to these people is far, far worse than most people know, or frankly, that I could have ever imagined. And so one of the ongoing battles, of course, by the CIA is to keep as much of that secret as possible. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out with her nomination. But the other thing that is significant is in, I want to say 2008, but I'm not sure of the year, a number of courts became aware that there were videotapes of the torture inflicted on Nashiri and another detainee by the name of Abu Zubaydah. And at least 2 separate district courts ordered the government and the CIA to preserve those because they would be exculpatory evidence in at least one death penalty trial that was being held in federal court, and I think there were some other potential cases as well. And at least according to published reports, and a guy by the name of Jose Rodriguez who admits this, and apparently Gina Haspel essentially defied the court orders and destroyed these tapes. And so this is who has been nominated to be the head of the CIA.
What are the conditions like for Mr. Nashiri now?
He's in jail in Guantanamo. He's in what they call Camp 7, which is a special camp that is for the CIA, the people who were in CIA custody. An awful lot of that is classified, so I can't really talk about it other than it's probably about like being in a bad county jail. That's how one person's described it.
Yeah. What's it like to be a defense attorney at Guantanamo? I've heard you talk about this before. It's quite an experience, isn't it?
Well, the military, how many of you have been in the military? Okay, the military, to its credit, will have a certain modicum of politeness even when they hate you. And so, they're always civil, and we go in the guards, or it's no different than any other jail visit. It's a little bit more burdensome, but they're polite enough and civil enough. There is this sort of weird sense of undertone of stuff, but in some respects, it's not that different than going to other jails.
But you can't just decide like this afternoon you decide you want to go talk to your client. You can't just do that, right?
No, I mean essentially every trip to Guantanamo is at least a week, because you have to fly for the most part on a military flight. You have to get approval for every visit. You have to make arrangements in advance. We've gotten down there, and for one reason or another, the visit's been canceled. I mean, there's a lot of steps. There's a lot of bureaucracy that's involved with it, that makes the system incredibly cumbersome. And I mean, just one thing, and there's a panel tomorrow at SPIA.
Right.
And I think it'll be discussed more there. But the 9/11 case, as long as it remains in Guantanamo, there will never be a trial. And I'm not sure in Nashiri that's not the case too. But the system is so cumbersome, so haphazard, and frankly so flawed that I'm not sure that it's not just become theater where all these lawyers do stuff, but they never really make any progress towards trial. So it's I call it being in the Guantanamo goo. I mean, I had a funny experience last year. We had a series of hearings in June, and a professor from the University of Georgia Law School was there, and she said, I was last here in 2012, and you guys are arguing about almost exactly the same stuff now as you were arguing about in 2012. It's like a time warp. And that's one of the really frustrating things about it, is that you never really made any progress towards trial, even before all the recent drama.
Yes. Speaking of the recent drama, what can you tell us about why you're not making so many trips anymore to Guantanamo?
Well, in June, the Chief Defense Counsel advised us that he had received information that our meetings, all the defendants, not just us, meetings with their clients may not be truly private. And there's always been suspicions that there was eavesdropping. A few years ago, we discovered that smoke detectors where we met with our clients were really microphones. But of course, they were never used, right? And so in any event, what happened, the short version of what happened is the government then imposed this wall of secrecy. And, we were immediately told everything pertaining to this is classified. And you can tell when they're serious when they start talking about Lynn Stewart, who you may know. She was a lawyer in New York who supposedly revealed classified information and was sent to prison. And so, when they really want to convince you that we're serious about this nonsense of it being classified, they start sending memos. Remember Lynn Stewart? Well, as we say in Indiana, I was born at night, but not last night. And, the government doesn't classify nothing. They'll classify dishonest stuff, they'll classify corrupt stuff, they classify torture. They may even occasionally classify stuff that really should be classified. But they don't classify nothing. So we knew there was something there. So we filed all kinds of stuff. And there was an open hearing in which the government absolutely assured us and the judge that whatever else is going on, nothing affects where Nashiri meets with his clients. So we called that bluff and asked that we be allowed to really sort of do an examination of the room and remove stuff. And the judge said, okay. And while there's a lot about that remains classified, what the government recently, like 2 weeks ago, declassified, and this all happened in September, was that we found microphones. in the room. And so we were prohibited from telling Nashiri about this because it was classified. The judge had specifically prohibited us from telling him. We asked for a hearing on this, who, what, where, when, how, the kind of thing you would expect that absolutely would happen. And the judge denied that. And so we were left in a position where we literally didn't know what to do. So we solicited advice from an ethics professor at Ellen Yaroshowski, who's one of the leading ethics professor, and basically said, what do we do here? And she looked at it, and there was a lot we couldn't tell her, but she concluded that we were obligated to withdraw.
Because you could not represent your client without being even able to tell him what was going on.
Right. I mean, it was an impossible position. Now, it wasn't, we then had to get approval from the chief defense counsel, who's a Marine Corps general lawyer, who looked at it independently, and he knew the classified information, but he did his own due diligence, and he concluded we were obligated to withdraw, and then he excused us. And so the fight has been that he excused us, and he believes, and I believe, that he is the final excusal authority. However, the judge says, no, I'm the final authority. And so myself and the two other lawyers who withdrew were, ordered to go to Guantanamo, and we refused. And when this all started, we were discussing this, and, somebody who was working with us said, you can get arrested. Now, as a criminal defense lawyer, I have said that to clients I don't know how many times. Hey, I don't know how this is going to work out, but you could get arrested. And I think I'm being sensitive and kind and gentle. And I will tell you, when you're on the other side of that, I had the distinct sense my heart stopped for a second. And there's no way to sugarcoat this. My sphincter absolutely nodded. As we say, gripped naga hide. And, this was a real, and has been for the last several months, especially for the other two lawyers. I was able to get the federal court in Indianapolis.
Yeah, I was going to say, you went to a federal judge.
Yeah, and was able to get the federal judge to essentially prohibit the government from arresting me, at least that one little piece of the government.
We're watching the halls, by the way.
It's okay. I'll take my chances. In any event, there's been this ongoing battle that is now morphed to the Court of Military Commission's review, a court in which the government has never lost a case. Okay? They've never been affirmed by the D.C. Circuit, but the government never loses in the Court of Military Commission's review. So who knows what will come out of that, and we will see.
Great. I want to leave lots of time for student questions. I want to circle back and ask you one more question about the criminal justice system in general. What would you most like to see changed about our current American criminal justice system? I'll put you in charge.
Well, I'd do it with one law. I think you could solve enormous problems in the United States with one law. That it'd be illegal to own, possess, manufacture, think about owning, possessing, or manufacture firearms, and really get rid of firearms and go to a policy like Australia or New Zealand or Germany. And I know that's controversial, but unless, having had the opportunity to travel a lot throughout the world, when you go to a country where firearms are not so rampant and where the threat of the sort of random violence we live in, which doesn't affect us as much as it affects poor communities, but it still affects us in ways that I wasn't sensitive to until I had the opportunity to be in places where all of a sudden you weren't worried. I just don't think people appreciate how that affects our lives. And forget the school shootings. There are 100 cases that I can think of where, people are drunk, they're high, they're angry, they have a gun, and something happens, and then, they sober up and they're in jail, and it's just a mess. And if you didn't have that, I think life would be a lot different. I mean, obviously I'd change the penalties, and if you could find a way to deal with the racial problems in the system, but certainly gun control, real meaningful gun control would be...
Change the dynamics.
Would change a lot of the violence.
Okay. I want to open it up to your questions. The way it's going to work, because we have microphones and you don't, is ask your question. I will repeat the question to the best of my abilities on microphone, and then Mr. Kammen can answer. Yes?
Can you describe, if there is one, a situation where you've needed to turn to the State Board of Ethics concerning attorney behavior, either defense or a judge or anything like that?
Okay. So the question is whether you've ever had a situation where you've gone to the State Board of Ethics or thought about going to the State Board of Ethics about another lawyer or judge.
The only one that comes to mind in the Camm case, the second prosecutor we discovered, actually other lawyers discovered that he had had entered into a deal to write a book while the case was going on, and certainly had this deal in place when he was deciding whether or not to prosecute the third trial. We moved to disqualify him based on that. He declined and really lied to the court. And because of the hearing, because of the nature, we've filed a disciplinary complaint against him. That's the only one I can think of. I suspect there's others where I thought about it, but that's the only one where I actually put pen to paper.
As a private defense attorney, what have you found the most successful ways to recruit clients?
Okay, so the question is, being a private defense attorney, what are some of the successful ways that you obtain clients?
Win cases. The best source of referral is a satisfied client. I found. I mean,
This is probably a question more for your. Yeah, I mean, at this point in your life, people find you, but earlier on.
Well,
earlier on.
Sure, and but lawyers pay attention to other lawyers. They pay attention. There was a lot more publicity and a lot more coverage of the courts when I was growing up, if you will, which made it easier. But lawyers get a sense of who's good, and so the lawyers who don't do it, they get a client, they want the client to be well represented, so they would refer it to you. Clients go out and say, hey, Rick Kammen was my lawyer and he kicked ass, and so, I mean, the internet has changed things for sure, but at the end of the day, the best way of recruiting clients is to be good and to do the work.
Can I want to follow up just quickly. What would you say are the key qualities that make you a good defense lawyer, or anyone a good defense lawyer? You don't have to put it in personal terms.
Well, I mean, certainly you have to have knowledge, and you have to have courtroom abilities, and that's not everyone does, and there's no shame in that. The second, you have to be a good communicator, because at the end of the day, you are dealing with people who are in varying degrees of terrified. I mean, I joke about it, but when somebody said to me, you may get arrested, even with all my knowledge and ability, that was scary. And then you have the guy who doesn't have that knowledge, who doesn't have the contacts. I mean, that's hugely terrifying, and helping them and helping their families make good decisions is about communications. So I would say those are the two things, and you know, and the willingness to fight and the willingness to be unpopular. Because if you do this work, you are going to take positions sometimes that are not going to be popular. And, you know, I've never felt threatened particularly or anything like that, but, you know,
A little bit of a fighter, huh?
no, you got to be. I mean, look, everyone, if somebody is charged with murder, child molesting, he's got enough people looking down on him. He doesn't need his lawyer looking down on him. He needs his lawyer to ethically, legally, properly, but be on his side. And you have to do that. You have to be willing to do that, even if the person's unpopular, even if they're guilty, because that's the way it's supposed to work.
So I want to thank you for being here and for your service.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm particularly interested in the Guantanamo.
Sure.
Al-Nashiri case. And, so I actually worked for President Obama's transition team, drafting all those beautiful executive orders.
Thank you.
Saying, you know, no more black sites, no more torture. And the Guantanamo one, I remember when we were talking, I was the DOJ team person.
Right.
Not the policy person. But we're talking about, should we say we're going to close Guantanamo in a year or 6 months? You know, and how quickly can we do this? And so I'm curious, like in retrospect, so President Obama, very sincere at the outset about doing that, and then went up against, you know, all kinds of things, politics. But I'd love, you know, in your experience, your reflections on, could we have closed Guantanamo in a year? You know, and what, any advice? I think it's useful looking back, even if it doesn't help us in the future.
Well,
And let me, in 30 seconds, the version is your reflections on whether this whole Guantanamo situation, could we have done it differently? Could we have closed Guantanamo?
you were there and I wasn't, so you have better insight than I do. It's easy to sit here as a defense lawyer and say, well, the President of the United States should have done this or should have done that. But I don't think he appreciated that the Republicans had made a decision. We now know, certainly before he was even inaugurated, that anything he was for, they were against. And it was just, so you had people like McCain, who was in favor of closing Guantanamo, voting against it. I've often thought in hindsight, and you know, he would have burned a lot of bridges, and I can see from a presidential perspective why he wouldn't have done this. But if he'd have said, okay, I'm loading all these people on planes, and the plane is on the runway, and that plane's either going to New York or Charleston, or it's going to the Middle East, but that plane is leaving Guantanamo in the next 18 hours. So you guys tell me where you want the plane to go. But this sumbitch is going to be closed. Now, had he done that, he would have gotten nothing else through Congress ever, but it would have been closed. But again, that's looking back on it. The other thing, I never appreciated that, you know, you hear these stories about the military and how they spend money and it's this sort of world unto themselves. I was in Guantanamo within 2 weeks after the executive order. And the military was building shit like mad. I mean, they were building houses. I think they had started to renovate the gym. It's one of the nicest gyms I've ever been in. It was clear they had no plans to close it. And that's the other thing that is at work, is there's a lot of contractors and a lot of businesses making a lot of money out of Guantanamo. And I don't know that people really realize the effect of that as well.
Yes, and then
So, we've been talking a lot in legal professions class about the responsibilities of lawyers to respect their clients' decisions about, you know,
Sure.
strategic development. And in particular, we've been looking at the McCoy v. Louisiana case that's in front of the Supreme Court. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that issue of what sort of strategic decisions a defense lawyer can take in opposition to their client's wishes.
Okay. So the question is, what's your opinion of situations where a defense attorney has a radically different view about what's a good strategy from their own client's view, and the McCoy case before the Supreme Court?
My view is mixed. People don't get to be capital defendants by having good judgment. And so, you know, when my capital clients would say to me, well, my best judgment is this and such, my response would often be, your best judgment is what got your ass here. Maybe you ought to take a look at it. And that's the problem when you have, and I mean this, when you have the responsibility, especially in a capital case, for a client's life, those of us who do the work know that the battle is over credibility. You have to have credibility with the jury because they're going to convict your client, and then we are going to say, okay, I've tried to convince you that there was some doubt, or you know, that there was some defense or something, and now I want you to save his life. And if they think you're just a BS artist, you got no chance. So I think it's far more complex than just the superficial, this is what the client wants, you have to do it. Now, I think part of the obligation of lawyers, and when I talked about being a good communicator, is to work with the client to help the client reach the right decision. And that may take enormous patience, and sometimes you can't do it, and we've all been there, but you know, it does take enormous time and patience, and it's, you know, so you're sort of thinking, well, I'm wasting my time here, but in the end, you may not be.
There's a hand back there. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, yeah, me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, what's your take on the contemporary status of the various branches of forensic science? Because they've been embarrassed in these fascinating ways lately that I really enjoy personally watching. I enjoy watching their comeuppance or whatever. So what's your take?
All right, so the question is, your take on the recently exposed failings of forensic science.
I'm glad, because an awful lot of forensic science is witchcraft and bullshit. The Camm case was about blood spatter, and blood spatter is, beyond sort of the basics, is absolute BS. And I think it's one of the functions is the courts have become, I don't know that it was always this way, it may have always been, but you know, there is this desire on the part of appellate courts to affirm cases. And so there's an acceptance of forensic science, certainly in Indiana, and I think every place, that's really unjustified. A lot of it's just nonsense.
Ashley?
Going back to jury credibility, when, especially in capital cases, when your clients have had like mental health issues, how do you handle that double-edged sword?
Okay, so the question is, how have you handled the double-edged sword of capital or other clients who have mental illness issues, but particularly capital clients?
Well, in a capital case, the goal of mitigation is to not provide an excuse for the crime. You can't often excuse most crimes, and certainly most death penalty offenses. But you can explain it. And so explaining, the way I describe it is you're basically describing the client's journey from being a baby in his mother's arms to the person sitting in the courtroom. What happened? Where, if you will, did the rot in the tree set in, and at what age, and how did this unfold? And so finding a way to have the mental illness be consistent with, you know, it may well provoke an insanity defense, but also be consistent with, all right, he wasn't legally insane, which very few people would be, But here, this explains how he got here. And here are all the signs where the mental illness was diagnosed and where society didn't treat it and didn't, observe it, or his parents overlooked it or what have you. So it's about fitting it into the bigger picture. You just can't say, well, he's mentally ill, so don't kill him. It's all got to explain how he became the defendant sitting here in the courtroom.
So explanation versus excuse.
Absolutely.
Okay. How many death penalty cases have you tried?
Actually
Yes.
tried. I think 6 or 7
Okay.
have actually gone to trial. Most are pled or get resolved one way or another.
Okay. I'll come to you, but I want to see anyone else who hasn't asked a question? Yes.
You mentioned that there are like monetary and contract interests potentially in Guantanamo.
Sure.
How much would you say that may have had an impact domestically in terms of just like sentencing, increasing penalties?
You mean like private prisons, that kind of thing? Okay, so the question is, domestically, are there entrenched financial interests that are adversely affecting
Sure.
the system?
Absolutely. Years ago, I happened to be in D.C. and I was in a bar and ended up drinking with a guy who was admitted he was a lobbyist for a private prison company. And he was very forthright. We need tougher laws. We need bigger sentences. So, this, and what has happened, when I started, Indianapolis was a blue-collar town. There were a lot of manufacturers, a lot of manufacturing plants, automotive businesses, that sort of thing. Well, those are all gone, and what has replaced businesses in a lot of smaller towns are prisons. And so there is this industry, and you see towns now trying to get prisons to come there because they're employers. Well, once a prison is there, then the town has an interest in keeping it filled, and I don't think you can overlook the connection that these things work together.
Ryan. I'll get to you.
I was just going to ask, as you've worked with more junior attorneys, especially people who are just out of law school, what do you wish we were teaching at law schools to people who come into criminal law? Is there kind of training that would be especially useful to give to young attorneys who are just freshly minted JDs?
That's a great Bradley Fellows question. So the question is, what should we be doing better to prepare our students to do what you do?
I'm not suggesting you don't, but train people to listen. Criminal law in general, but certainly criminal law, at the end is about people. And you can be the most scholarly, I know brilliant lawyers who are so smart it just makes you want to cry, but who don't have enough sense to pour piss out of a boot. And they're just, they're just hopeless. And, they don't listen, and they are all live in their heads. What happens in the real world is people make decisions in their hearts, and they rationalize it in their heads. And so training lawyers, training students to listen, to really critically listen, not always to the words, but to what's going on in the other person's heart, is something that took me a long time to learn, and I think is really critical to being successful in criminal law.
Allison.
Well, I have 3 questions, but I'll ask them for the.
I'm happy to stay late, so
I'll see you later this afternoon, too.
Okay.
I'll ask this for the benefit of everyone else in white-collar crime currently. Might you have some dirt on Professor Morrison?
All right, question is, anything you can give to the students of Professor Morrison that will help them in white-collar criminal
great
law?
lawyer, better man.
As I suspected. I'll ask my real question. McCoy v. Louisiana.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you think of that case that's pending?
Well,
It's along the lines.
Yeah.
No, it's along the lines of what this gentleman asked. It wouldn't surprise me if the Supreme Court doesn't reverse, because, again, I think one of the realities is people on the Supreme Court aren't in the trenches and don't, for the most part, have any real idea of how these things work in the real world. So it wouldn't surprise me if they didn't reverse and say that that lawyer was wrong for doing it the way he was doing. But I will tell you, from having been in that position, it is far more complicated than I think that case presents.
We're just about out of time, so I'm going to close with one final opportunity for you, Rick. You've already done this quite a bit, but what final words of advice would you give for people, many of whom sitting here are hoping to pursue a career in the field that you have practiced in so well? What words of advice would you have for them?
It's certainly not for everybody. If you do this, I mean, the reality is that I've been lied to by clients, judges, prosecutors, other lawyers. You tend to see the world through a prism that is different. You also, because you can't be judgmental about your clients, you end up seeing the world in a different way also, which may not be the best way. And so, there are some occupational hazards. You carry around a lot of people's grief, a lot of people's pain, a lot of people's anger. On the other hand, every once in a while you get to help somebody. And that's a pretty cool thing.
Well, I think I can say with certainty that you've helped more than a few people and have been one of the best helpers of people in this realm that we have known here for a very long time in the state of Indiana. So thank you so much for